Hello and welcome to John's Client Tax School and my presentation on rollovers, part 1. I'm John Lucadellis. I'm a lawyer in Hamilton who specializes in income tax law, and my discussion today is intended as a very basic introduction to the rollover concept, which is essential to almost any kind of tax-driven reorganization that a taxpayer could undertake. Before I begin, however, I want to start with a disclaimer. It's important to understand that this video is aimed at Canadians. It discusses only Canadian income tax law, which is obviously not applicable to anyone who's not in Canada or a Canadian resident. The presentation is for educational purposes only. It's not intended as legal advice. Almost certainly, is not going to apply to your circumstances. If you need to undertake a tax-driven reorganization or you need tax advice, it's absolutely essential that you consult your own tax advisor. So what is a rollover? Well, we have to start with the basics of what a capital gain is. Basically, if you dispose of any kind of capital property, to the extent that the proceeds you receive exceeds the tax cost of the property, you realize a capital gain, one half of which must be included in income, and that one half that must be included is a taxable capital gain. So that's what happens ordinarily when you dispose of capital property. On a rollover, if you dispose of the property, you are deemed to receive proceeds equal to the cost of the property for tax purposes, so that no tax arises on the disposition. Tax cost here is usually the purchase price of an asset. There are various adjustments sometimes to the tax cost of an asset for tax purposes, but by and large it's usually going to be the cost of the property to the taxpayer, and that is usually referred to in the Income Tax Act as the adjusted cost base of the property. And so, as I said, if the fair market value proceeds that you receive for an asset exceed its tax cost, then you will have a taxable capital gain on the sale. The taxable capital gain is 50% of the capital gain, and that must be included in income. So on a $100 capital gain, if you are otherwise subject to tax in Ontario at the top rates, you'll pay tax of about $23 on a $100 capital gain, because you have to include $50 of that capital gain in income, and you'll pay tax on that $50 at a top rate of about 46%, so that ends up being $23 of the $100 capital gain. So this bar is meant to illustrate this this concept. We have an asset that has value represented by the total size of the bar. The green portion is the tax cost, or the ACB. You're not subject to tax on that green portion. If you sell an asset and you receive back your cost, you're generally speaking not subject to tax in Canada again in respect of that cost. What you are subject to tax on is this red portion, the inherent gain that is accrued but unrealized in respect of the asset. So what happens on a share-for-share exchange is that you should be able to take advantage of a so-called rollover. So if we have common shares in the capital of a corporation and we exchange those for special shares, so we enter into an agreement with the corporation where we say, look, I'm selling back to you my common shares and I'm expecting you to issue special shares with the same fair market value to me as payment for my common shares. So you enter into an agreement like that with the corporation. You sell your common shares, you take back these special shares. You have disposed of the property, there's no question about that. You've received something back that has different rights and so forth associated with it. Special shares usually have a fixed value, for example, whereas common shares do not. But for tax purposes, we are able to do it on a deferred basis, on a rollover basis, because nothing has really changed from a tax perspective. The tax cost is the same. You see the green portion in the special shares is the same as the green portion in the common shares. And the inherent gain is the same too, because we've taken care to ensure that the special shares have a fair market value that's equal to the fair market value of the common shares that we disposed of. So the Act says, well, From a tax perspective, not much has changed, or nothing has changed from a tax perspective, and so we'll permit this exchange to occur on a rollover basis without any realization of tax, simply as a result of that exchange. So to recap, if we sell shares in the capital of a corporation that are capital property, and that's usually the case, shares in the capital of a private corporation are usually capital property to the holder. If we sell those shares to the corporation, receive back shares of another class, so if we sell common shares to the corporation, receive back special shares, the fair market value of the new shares is equal to the fair market value of the old shares, then the disposition of the old shares occurs at their cost, or the Act contains another rule that applies to share-for-share exchanges that says that there's no disposition at all. It's very important that the fair market value of the new shares is equal to the fair market value of the old shares. If you don't get that right, if you take back special shares, for example, that have a value that's less than the value of the common shares that you sold, then there are various anti-avoidance rules in the Income Tax Act that can basically have some fairly negative consequences from a tax perspective for the individual who exchanged the shares. So the inherent gain is the same in the new class of shares, the new shares that you've taken back. That's why you'll sometimes hear tax practitioners refer to the a share-for-share exchange or a rollover as a tax-deferred transfer of property. That's because the inherent gain is the same. The tax on that inherent gain hasn't disappeared, it's just that it's been deferred. It's not realized at the time of the exchange. The rules in the Act say, no, there's no tax now, but the inherent gain is the same. And so if you were to turn around and do not a share-for-share exchange, not a rollover, but say sell the shares to an arm's length third party, you'd realize a gain at that time, and so you've deferred the gain from the time of the exchange to the time of the sale to the third party. So that's why we refer to it as a deferred exchange. So that's the basics of a rollover, very important concept for reorganizations. In an upcoming video, I hope to get into more detail about Section 85 rollovers, which are very common and very important in reorganizations.